Hi there, and welcome to this week's video. Now, there's so much that we can talk about when it comes to our understanding of our written, oral, and other forms of communication, that this week, this video is really just going to serve as a possible introduction for those topics, and to get you thinking about them a little bit more. I hope that you will spend some good time reviewing the readings and the other learning materials for this week, because much of the information that is vital for this unit is contained within those. But let's think a little bit about our language. Language is, as we know, a subsystem of the brain. It is a coding system that we have developed, and we communicate so often through our language that we don't actually even think of the fact that we codify and decodify messages. And of course, when people have different coding systems, different languages, then the opportunity for us to misunderstand one another is exemplified all the more and exacerbated all the more. Now, as an exercise, I want you to think of these three words. Do you know what they mean? Take a moment and think about how you would define this word. What does this word mean? What kind of definition would you create for this word without looking it up, without looking on Google? But just off the top of your head, could you find an accurate definition to this word? Well, we'd probably struggle, right? We could guess, we could think through it, we could maybe look at some of the etymology involved and come up with what we think might be an accurate definition. But what if I gave you two other words, but along with them I gave you a little bit more information about what that word would mean, and then asked you to use that word in a sentence? You would be able to do that even though you may never, until a few moments ago, have heard the word backsheesh. You could probably use it in a sentence and it would make just about the right amount of sense. But that's because our coding systems in our brains and in our minds have wired us in such a way that we're able to take words and piece them together and decodify them. Now, as you would have done in some of the reading for this unit, you would have come across the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, historically, anthropologists and linguists have often grouped language, culture, and race together, as though any one of them automatically implied the other two. But more linguistic anthropologists generally agree that culture, race, and language are distinct. Now, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis predominantly has two main principles, even though it is complicated and I don't want to try to oversimplify it, but these are the two main principles. One is the principle of linguistic determinism, that says the way one thinks is ultimately determined by the language that you speak. And the second is what he calls linguistic relativity, which says that the differences among languages must therefore be reflected in the differences in the worldview of their speakers. Now, contemporary linguists believe that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a little bit overstated. It doesn't take into account the global nonverbals that people often have. For example, Chomsky argues that all of human language share a universal grammar that is innate and that the human species has. Chomsky and other linguists claim that every child is genetically programmed for human language. Just as humans are programmed to walk upright, so humans are programmed with universal grammar. It's just part of the human brand, if you like. So what are some of the universals of language? Well, we know that speech, ultimately, if we're talking about a spoken word, it's transmitted through the auditory channel. We know that speech can be used to oppress and lift up people at the same time. We know that it can be specialized, it's reflexive, it's able to be displaced from time and space, it's able, of course, to be false, it's able to be codified in different ways. And so language, what it ultimately is a restricted code, because our language is limited to what we're actually able to say, our vocabulary. If you have a smaller vocabulary, you're limited in terms of what you can actually say. So it can become, in itself, a barrier to communication. And that's not even taking into account what we might call direct and indirect styles of communication. This is the direct style of communication values overt expressions of intention, and often in direct communication cultures, an increased vocabulary, an opportunity that people have to argue their points, to make cogent statements, to have an expanded way of articulation is seen as very important. But in indirect styles of communication, it is not as important to have as an expansive a vocabulary as much as it is important to portray the right characteristics in nonverbal ways. Now let's think a little bit about how people of different cultures actually do speak. What does their language tell us about their culture? For example, the Navajo Native Americans have no possessives in their language. So in other words, no his, her, or mine. What does that tell you about the culture? The Pinan people of Borneo have one word for he, she, or it, but 6 different words for we. Some languages have more than one word for the same kind of color. What do these things tell you about these different languages? Think about that for a moment. I like what Tom Brewster says when he says learning a language and culture through relationships in a community requires a tremendous commitment to the people of that new language. If your goal is to live with people, to love and serve them, to become a belonger in the community, then learning the language is a great means to that goal. I think sometimes, especially in countries like South Africa, where people speak multiple languages or there are multiple languages spoken, sometimes people forget how important it is for people to speak and communicate in their mother tongue, because it actually is the way in which they think through relationships in life. So, if you're struggling with language, if you're one of those people who struggles to learn a new language like myself, you have to make a commitment to say, I want to take a class. I want to find somebody who speaks that language and have them speak it to me. I want to gather some tools. There's a lot of tools online today that people can take. Learn to do something in the language. Learn how to greet people, very basic things even, that'll help you in learning that language, because that is really the key to intercultural communication, is being able to communicate in a way that people can actually understand you. Now let's turn our attention briefly to the idea of textual written communication. Well, more people today communicate by emails, by text messages, by WhatsApp and various other social media platforms than ever before in the history of humankind. Now the problem is, of course, without this ability to see somebody face to face, we can very easily misunderstand what somebody is saying. We don't get immediate feedback, and therefore a message that was meant in one way can be very easily misread in another way. Even though a lot of people today do use email, they're not necessarily very adept or proficient at being able to email well. So one of the things that I think is important for you to learn, especially going into a professional environment, is to learn the essentials of email etiquette. What are some basics to understand? It's very important that you understand tone. Tone that is very hard to interpret of a written word. Think of how you are providing your attachments to people. How are they filed? Are they filed for your convenience or for the convenience of the person who's receiving them? How do you communicate a complaint or a particularly thorny issue? What are some things that you should never talk about over email? And there certainly are those things. When it comes to tone, it's important to write in a positive tone, depending on who you're talking to. For example, if you're writing the lecturer, professor of this class, it's very important that you are professional in your conduct for doing so. Avoid the emoticons, the smileys, the winks. Avoid a very informal tone, at least at first, until you're given permission to refer and talk to people in an informal manner. When you are lodging a complaint, for example, you may not like the way I graded your assignment. That's okay, but it's important how you communicate that information. And quite frankly, often how you communicate that information is probably going to go a long way to getting the result that you ultimately are desiring. Now let's talk a little bit about texting. Well, it's very important to remember that in our tech-savvy world, even though everyone uses texting and WhatsApp, not everyone understands everything the same way. For example, and of course there are many examples of these types of misunderstandings that occur, particularly within generations. But it's important that we communicate in a way that allows people to actually understand what we're saying. Here's a great example of a sample of conversation without these grammatical markers inserted. Just look at this text conversation. Now, in the first instance of this text conversation, it's hard to see what is actually being meant, what is the tone that is being spoken of here. But in the second incident, when there is some question marks, some smiley faces inserted, some capitalization, now we actually begin to see some of the context, and it's interpreted in a completely different way. Finally, when it comes to social media, it's important to think about how you use social media. Blogs, tweets, Facebook, those are prevalent in our society today, and they're not going away. A book that I would recommend that everybody reads is a book called Here Comes Everybody by Clay Shirky, which talks about principles for being able to think through how one engages in social media interaction. Here's just one example of how we can get ourselves into some serious trouble. And of course, in the South African context, and in the US context, there's so many different examples we could use. But here's one from a few years ago. A young lady called Justine Sacco, who was on her way to Cape Town from the US. And as many people do, posts some pictures of herself, some selfies before she gets on the plane, sends a tweet just before she leaves. She no doubt thought that was quite humorous, and all of a sudden she set off a Twitter storm while she was on the airplane, and a lot of people actually began commenting, and of course she even ended up with her own hashtag, has Justine landed yet? And of course when she did land in Cape Town, someone was on hand to take a picture of her, and she realized that her whole world was about to change, and as a result of that tweet, she lost her job. Now we can look at someone like Justine and say, well, how stupid you were, or how racist you were, but very often people tweet before they think, and in today's world that can have very, very dire consequences. And finally, think about your nonverbals. Nonverbals vary from culture to culture. Knowing what nonverbals to use, when to use them, how to use them is very, very important. There's a number of little videos that you can find on YouTube that actually talk about those things, and I recommend that you try and find some and realize, especially if you're going to a different country, what those things could be. Because nonverbals often complement, accent, substitute, repeat, or contradict a verbal message. A lot of things that we do in a non-verbal manner that actually are communicating things very, very overtly. And if we fail to pick up on those cues, we can actually offend people that we're trying to develop a relationship with. So make sure that you think through these things and review them this week. A very important topic for us to discuss.